Let's go! I see people. Woo!
Hello, everyone. We're back. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Another exciting live stream today. We're going to live stream the third talk that we had witnessed at ICPCC by Laura. Welcome, Laura. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And this is a special week. It's July 4th week in the US. I know both of you are in the US. Where are you two right now?
I'm in Palm Beach, Florida.
So not too far from where we had the conference. And you, Isaac?
I'm in South Padre Island.
I have no idea where that is. And I'm sure some of the people watching might have the same question. So why don't you enlighten us?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of in Texas, close to the border of Mexico, and it's a really interesting island because most of the area around here is very arid and dry. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, palm trees appear, and you've got a normal like island format. So yeah, my parents have a bay house here. It's kind of a family tradition to come, and spent last night catching a bunch of trout. Good old fashioned American fun. It's been a good time.
Good old fashioned American fun. Before we talk a bit more about what you guys did for July 4th, and before we dive deeper into the talk, I see that there's quite a few people that are already watching this live stream. Here's a question for you. If everyone knows Independence Day for the US is July 4th, but if anyone can guess Independence Day for Switzerland, what that date is, we'll give a shout out. So put it in the comments if you think you know when that is. Yeah, and just quickly, maybe Laura, what did you do for July 4th? Is it a day off for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was my first day of not opening up my laptop since Christmas Day. So I just literally caught up on some sleep and really relaxed.
Nice. And were you in West Palm Beach for that as well, or did you travel?
No, I don't even think I left my bed on the 4th. I just really focused on rest.
That's good to hear. And Isaac, we talked a bit earlier this week. I think it was right after July 4th, and you mentioned that you drove 8 hours with your family, a car full with kids, to get where you are right now. And I said, like, that would probably ruin my energy for like at least a week. I grew up in Switzerland, and here 20 minutes is like a standard drive, and an hour is a very long drive. So anything.
That's nothing. One time I drove from Houston to El Paso. It's a 14-hour drive, and then I get there. My brother-in-law is like, "Oh, let's go to this great steak place. It's 2 hours back the way you came." I wanted to cry and punch him at the same time. No, it wasn't too bad of a drive, but the 4th was great. We have a swimming pool and a huge, beautiful bay in front of us. So we watched the fireworks show over the bay from the swimming pool at night, which was a really fun experience. And earlier that day, from my dad, 4th of July is also my dad's birthday. So I smoked what they call it, a pork butt. It's technically a pork shoulder, but it's a 10-pound piece of pork, and then you make pulled pork out of it. And it's the first time I ever smoked one of those, but came out great. So
nice. Sounds like we should do one of our team retreats in some Padre Island not too long from now. Okay, lots more to talk about steak and barbecue and celebrations. I see a few more people have joined. If you can guess what day, or guess or look up, I guess, or if you know what day Independence Day is in Switzerland, put it in the comments. We'll give you a shout out. But now it's time to talk about what we came here for, which is one of the ICPCC live streams. It was Laura's session where you talked about the Wild West. Wait, what was it? Wild Wide Web3 was the title of your talk. And before we go and watch that talk, it'd be interesting to hear a bit about, like, what do you think about the conference?
I really enjoyed the conference. It was more intimate, and people were genuinely tuning into everyone's talk and taking notes and being very engaged, which was a nice change of pace from like your bigger like Bitcoin conference vibe type things. And then the community was like a very educated community, which is great because it helps that the developers already have a strong sense of what they're doing and how they're operating. And speaking to them, I actually had a little butterflies. I speak a lot, but that stage, I had a little nerves going into that talk just because it felt it just felt like such an intense atmosphere. I really enjoyed it.
That's great to hear. Thanks so much. And I see we get some comments. Let me bring up the correct answer from Test Puddle. 1st of August. Yes. Looks like Test Puddle is from Canada, which I think it's also Canada Day on July 4th, right? We have a Canadian team member that mentioned that to me. And yes, August 1st is Switzerland Independence Day. And I'm actually going to be in Switzerland for the first time in probably like 7 or 8 years during our Independence Day. And hopefully there's going to be
exciting.
some sort of
Nice.
celebration. All right. And what have you been up to, Laura, since the conference? It's now been almost 2 months, well, a little less, maybe 7 weeks since the conference. What does the week of a lawyer look like?
Well, immediately after your conference, there was the Bitcoin conference and I think another conference I had to attend. And then it was just a lot of catching up on work because conference weeks always make it a little hard to balance work and attending all the events and meeting all the people. And then I most recently was in Vegas for the World Series of Poker, where I performed pretty well. I definitely have unfinished business. I hope to make it back next year.
You said you performed pretty well. What does that mean for anyone that's curious now?
Well, I was in the top 30% of all the events I played. And for one of the events, I was 30 people away from being in the money. So I do feel so close.
Well done. Is that going to be an annual event for you? Something that you're going to try and go back to next year, or even like, do you regularly play poker? Are you looking?
Yeah, I think now that I've seen the WSOP and I know that I enjoy it, I'm going to try and like play more local tournaments and qualify that way maybe, or just in general, just play more to get a little bit more experience. And I'll try and make it back next year for sure.
Great.
That's great. I think it's good advertisement for a lawyer to be good at bluffing like that. So it's definitely something that you used to keep up. Yeah. So jumping into the talk, we're gonna play it for the first time publicly on the internet in a bit, and it's not the full talk, by the way. It's just the first 30 minutes of it, but it's great because it starts to get into some questions I think all of us have about the SNS and things like that. But yeah, looking back into the talk, is there anything that's kind of updated or new within the legal realm that maybe wasn't happening yet at the time? Because this was back in mid-May when we had the conference, and I know that a lot of new stuff have come out. So anything that you'd like to maybe update or change about what you gave at the talk, maybe if you go a few minutes through that, and then we can push the recording up here.
Yeah, so I think there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the U.S. markets and how they're deciding to regulate DAOs and tokens in general. But most recently on June 9th, the UkiDAO decision came out. And that really, the takeaway from that is that the CFTC, the Central Futures and Trading, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Yeah. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is almost a partner agency to the SEC. They're very parallel in a lot of the actions they take, whether or not you're a commodity or a security. So the CFTC took action against UkiDAO, and that really just tells us that the CFTC is willing to step in where the SEC isn't. So as we saw the SEC take a lot of heavy action towards tokens, maybe you're seeing the CFTC take a more proactive approach to DAOs type structures, and particularly DeFi oriented DAOs. So it was kind of a hit to that realm as a whole, but it's not that discouraging because there's definitely still a lot unresolved in that area. And I think the biggest takeaway in any of this is that there are generally paths forward for anything you want to do in this space. It's just the amount of homework you're willing to put in to navigate that risk. And that's where the attorneys come in. That's why if you talk to one attorney and they're like, oh, I'll give you a legal opinion for like $1,000, that legal opinion's not going to be, there's no homework done on that. Like that legal opinion might be very limited and not helpful at all. So if you have a complex issue, you should expect an appropriately complex amount of research to navigate that issue, because again, there's not a lot that doesn't have a path forward, but that the more complicated the path, the more homework needs to be done. And that's where me as an attorney comes in, and we have to create, more complex corporate structures and offshore entities and navigate things that way to really mitigate your risk and ensure that you're doing things in a safe and like less risky way.
Yeah, I think that's really it's really encouraging. First off, to hear that everything's possible if you do the right research and put things in place. And I know that in the Cohen State end, we're very interested in stablecoin type projects, which might not be mechanically, completely uncharted territory, but it's all about getting the legal side of things right. That's kind of the key thing, because like we all kind of understand how they generally work, but it seems like one of the biggest things is getting that aspect right to really win in that market. And so, it's great to have that approach. So, Cedric, anything you want to add before we jump into the recording here?
I just wanted to say that I was very positively surprised at the conference how interested everyone was. Because I think 5 years ago, probably, or even 3 years ago, a lot of founders in the Web3 space, they treated legal as kind of a necessary afterthought. But part of why we started Cohen State and why we create this umbrella where we also set up legal and tax structure for all the ventures that come and join us is because I, as an investor in various DeFi projects over the past 5, 6, 7 years, I've seen how so many founders spend more than 50% of their time on legal and tax questions instead of being fully focused on building their product and building out a service that lots of us can use. So I think it was great for me to see how interested everyone was and how the audience really got that this was so crucial to get right in today's day and age.
Yeah, exactly. And just a reminder out there, anybody who has a question, go ahead and put that question into the YouTube chat. We'll be able to highlight it afterwards. So we're going to go into a little bit of a continuation of the fireside chat after the recording here. But this is kind of your chance if you have a burning question about the legality. I know a lot of us are working on projects. And even if you're not working on a project, if you're just a participant, I mean, I know as a known neuron myself in the NNS, I've had questions just as a participant that I've offline enjoyed some great input from Laura with. So this is your chance to kind of get in there. So you might not be able to answer everything, right? So you can't give legal advice. So there might be restrictions there. But one thing I know about Laura is she's really great at getting to provide some useful input, right? One way or the other. So we're lucky to have her on here. But without further ado, here we go for watching the Wild Web3, Navigating the Legal Landscape for the Internet Computer by Laura Cole.
So I'm really excited to bring the stage. This is C Cole. She's an international blockchain attorney with Blockchain Legal LLP. They're a distributed law firm that specializes in helping clients navigate the technology sector and regulation. And she's going to come up and talk to us about the wild Web3 landscape. Please welcome LC to the stage.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. As Jesse said, I'm here to talk to you about legal. I want to thank Isaac and Cedric for having me. Happy to be here and help you guys. So they kind of brought me in to talk to you because for me, you all are developers, right? And it kind of panics me to think you guys are building these incredible things, but you don't know to stop and think about the implications of what you're building. So I like to talk to founders and builders about what it is you're building, why you need to care about what it is you're building, and how to protect it. Because you don't want to spend all the time building something to then realize you didn't protect it correctly, or you have exposures in legal areas and jurisdictions around the world, and you don't want to get stuck kind of getting trapped, getting fined, or having to close down shop or losing your IP. So when I talk to builders, I like to think about the overall thing. You guys aren't lawyers. You don't need to be lawyers. This is why my whole industry exists. So you want to think about what you can ask me and how I can help you, because lawyers are facilitators. We're not the bad guy. I'm not the SEC. I'm not here to stop you. I want to help you build. And so when I speak to builders, I like to focus on big picture stuff that you can kind of understand why you need to talk to me. In America, or any jurisdiction, people care about what you're building because they care about the flow of money. So in any jurisdiction, whether you're in America or not, as long as geopolitical boundaries exist, money matters. And where that money moves and how that money moves matters in those jurisdictions. So you keeping that in mind kind of helps you frame why it is you need to care. Because no matter what jurisdiction you're in, they're going to care about how the money's flowing and who the money's flowing to. That's just kind of a good way to intro maybe why you need a legal wrapper, like a C Corp or an LLC, or a Cayman Islands Foundation, or a British Virgin Islands Foundation, or a legal wrapper in Singapore. You need to exist in some way because jurisdictions care about your existence in some way if you have something to protect. If you don't have anything to protect, if you're just a group chat, or if you're just a group of people sharing ideas, maybe that's not something to protect. But if there's money involved, if there's a shared wallet, if there's shared IP, if you're building something, you might want to consider protecting what you're building and how you want to protect it. So you may think this kind of rubs up against the idea of a DAO, because it's very much the ethos of shared knowledge, shared resources. No one's really in charge. The voting and the governments are all kind of neutral. And that's really great in theory, but that's really challenging when jurisdictions care about these things. Jurisdictions are bureaucracies. Every government is a bureaucracy. So they've got a list of rules, and this new tech has to fit into some of these rules. The US is a particularly challenging jurisdiction. We have a lot of agencies fighting over how to navigate this space. You have the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, and I would argue that currently the IRS is probably the most savvy of those agencies when it comes to navigating this new tech, because they've added more resources, and as you can see from this year's tax return, the first question is, did you own digital assets? They're not hiding the ball that this is what they care about. They're making it very clear that digital assets and finding a way to capture that value is a significant priority for them. So you need to keep that in mind. The SEC obviously is the 900-pound gorilla in the room, right? So navigating that can be really challenging, because what we're talking about is your token a security? Is your token, or is your governance token or NFT a security? And what is a security? So the SEC has defined security as an investment contract in this world that we're in of digital assets. They're taking the track of whether or not this exists as an investment contract under the security definition. And that really means there's a 4-part test under the Howey case, and that is an investment of money in a shared pool with a group of others with the expectation of profits under the management of others or through the use of others. So these are kind of 4 broad categories: an investment of money into a pooled asset of some sort with the expectation of profits through management or power of others. These are really broad categories under the Howey test, right? So even if you think investment of money is obvious, right? It's really not that obvious. Your investment of money can come through cash, being on any exchange, whether it's in the US or not. It can come through, even if you launch your token for free, you could be considered priming the markets if there's an expectation that it will be bought for money later. So there's a lot of like tricks with that, even that first prong that seems really obvious. Is there an investment of money? The second one is to like a shared pool of people. It's a group of people. Now there's some ways that you can kind of get around that if you're an investment club, meaning you're just like this group of friends that's kind of pooling their cash together. That's came from a case in like the 1930s that was essentially this like group of old ladies that just started sharing money and investing together. But it requires very specific small groups of people to kind of get around that particular element. Otherwise, if you're buying an asset as a group, you're probably sharing that in some way. And if you want to think about it at a high level, even when you start a company, if you issue shares, that's considered a security unless all the shares are going to founders. And even still, that's captured in your like bylaws from your corporate documents. But if you have any sort of investor, that document, that safe note, that's your security. So even forming a company, the moment you issue shares, we're in the securities world. So that group pool idea is really what funds your company, and that's really where you need to focus on trying to think about how to navigate that zone while respecting the regulations that are out there. Then you have the idea that there's an expectation of profits. That's a little trickier because that's where utility comes in, or that's where governance comes in because you're sufficiently decentralized. And then you have through the management of others. And that's where DAOs become a little bit more powerful because you're even more decentralized. And you can argue maybe that this is so sufficiently decentralized that there's really not an expectation that others are managing this because the DAO as a whole is really navigating and moving this product forward. So keeping that in mind, there's a lot of nuance and ways that you have to navigate. That's just the SEC alone. And that's if these tokens or NFTs are considered securities. What if they're considered commodities? Now you've got the CFTC. Or you might have anti-money laundering laws that you have to deal with. Or you might have money transmitter laws if you're kind of a DeFi trading, or you've got money that's being housed like in wallets that you're moving. Now you've got money transmitter laws, and those are state by state. So keeping all of this in mind, there's a lot to navigate when it comes to the legal side of starting what it is you're trying to build. And this is all really heavy lifting that you don't want to care about, right? Because you're trying to build this really cool thing that's changing the world, or that you want to execute this awesome idea, or you have this community of people that just wants to create something and see what happens. And I think that is so powerful, and I think that's why when you're working with an attorney, you want to find someone that sees your vision, and wants to help you execute it or find a path forward. Because it can get really sticky quickly, but with the right attorney who understands the tech and wants to help, there's definitely paths forward. And I think this is a good time to bring Jesse up to kind of talk about how maybe this all implicates specifically the ICP system, because it's a little bit different than some other chains out there.
Give it up for LC, everybody. So we're gonna like hang out on stage and have a little fireside chat. I'm gonna sit down. This is nice. Relax a little bit. Laura, thanks again for joining us. I am very excited to plug you for information that I'm definitely going to use and might be useful to the crowd too here. So let's start out by digging into the SNS and the NNS. As you and everyone else here knows, the SNS is the new ICP Launchpad platform, and the NNS is our on-chain governance. So if you're building on ICP and in the future you think you're going to tokenize, you want to form a company, should you be thinking about like a C Corp or an LLC or nothing, or in the Bahamas? Let's talk a little bit about like where should you, if you've got a new project and you want to form something, where should you be thinking about forming it if tokenization is in your future?
That's a great question. And I'm going to preface this with what I'll preface most answers with, the most lawyer answer of all time. It depends. So it definitely depends on where you're at in your company stages. If you're kind of already a little bit funded, if you're not funded, if you just have an idea, if you're just trying to pull together a collective. If you are just like two people with an idea that are building something, it wouldn't really make sense to go pay the like $50K to go offshore into Cayman because you're trying to launch a token. I think it makes a little bit more sense to just form an LLC to protect your ideas, to create a legal document that kind of captures the relationship between the people that are working on the product in a way that protects everybody, protects the ideas, and allows you to move forward with a little bit of seriousness because you took the time to have a legal wrapper, but not so much heavy lifting that you need to pull in an attorney immediately and like codify all your IP, trademark everything. It doesn't have to get that serious that fast. But as you kind of grow, I like to tell builders to just be thoughtful. And what I mean by that is where you're at today, touch base with what you think you need to protect legally. And as you grow and you get more stake in the game, you need to constantly think like, how do I protect this, or is it protected? So kind of just do a touch base where you're like, did I build something? Is there funding now to protect? Is there more IP to protect? Am I seeking investor money? Am I talking to angel investors? Do I have enough of a community to kind of go for a launch? And each stage of that game, you might want to add a little bit more legal protection. So once you have an idea that's worth protecting and you've got like a fund on the line or a VC that's ready to cut a check, now you're looking more like a Delaware C Corp. That's generally what angel investors, VCs, and just general business like to see. Delaware has done a lot in business, protects a lot, and they're just a good state to incorporate in because there's a history of litigation and company-specific problems that they have taken the time to deal with that other states aren't as savvy on. So Delaware's a good state, but your home state might be a good state too. The states that have DAO legislation are, I would say, a really lovely attempt to create a conversation. But does that mean those states are where you should form your DAO? I wouldn't suggest, unless you have a compelling reason. Like if you live in Wyoming, maybe that's a good option for you. But if you're in Florida or another state and you think Wyoming's where you want to put your DAO because Wyoming wrote some statute related to DAOs, that might not be a good solution for you because a lot of DAOs are just Delaware LLCs as of today, as they kind of grow and develop.
Yeah. And for anyone that hasn't done it, if you want to form a business and base it in Delaware, it takes about 45 minutes to do that online. So if you use like LegalZoom or Stripe Atlas or something like that, that's like an off-the-shelf, like,
Just get something formed. If you have an idea that's worth protecting and you're working with someone, form something that protects both of you so that it's like a step forward in the relationship. You have a formal agreement to say you care about this thing you're building. And that makes it just having a little bit of skin on the line for you and those co-founders. And it also clarifies what happens if this kind of fizzles, or if a co-founder decides to leave and step out, but the other guys continue building. The amount of calls I get right now, because we're in such a crypto builders market, the amount of calls I get right now are where people had to quit because they got to go back to a day job to make ends meet. But there's a guy on the team that's like, no, man, I'm convicted, I'm building this. But they don't have a formal exit. So now that guy that's building it is super exposed because the other guy kind of gets to free ride a little bit and has arguable interest in what the other guy's still building because they didn't take time to protect themselves and because they didn't formally exit. And so I do a lot of like nuisance agreements where you kind of like, you have to pay the other guy out, just like a nuisance payment to be like formally gone because you didn't just think about what you were doing in the beginning. So the more you think about up front, even the light lifts, like just an LLC or a C Corp on LegalZoom, that can be such a light lift. But if you do it early on, then you can save yourself a $5,000 or a $10,000 nuisance payment to get that guy out while you're still building.
$10,000, you're getting off cheap for the payment, like
Well,
like
I mean,
that.
it's early on.
Yeah.
I'm a good negotiator.
Oh, okay, good to know. And you're available for hire.
Yeah,
if any.
absolutely.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I mean, I can even speak from experience, like setting up these kind of contracts, they're not for when times are good, they're for
Yeah.
when times are bad. And that you write these contracts, and the hope is you put it in a drawer and you never need to look at it again.
Exactly.
But if you do need it, then you're not just making it up as you go along. You go back, and that forms the basis for the partnership. So you have something to build off of.
Exactly. And a lot of times it's emotional when it's gone bad. So people get hot-headed and it can just get complicated really quickly. So it's just trying to be thoughtful along the way.
Yeah. So let's go through an imaginary scenario where I have a recently formed Delaware C Corp, and I'm thinking about, as an American citizen, and I'm thinking about launching on the SNS. What should I be thinking about, and what concerns I should have?
Yeah, so you need to really think about why it is you're launching a token and not just kind of launching a product. Because if you're doing a token launch to raise money, that is a huge red flag for the SEC, because the SEC was created as a way to protect investors, and that just means they are trying to protect people from investing in things they don't know about. So the SEC has the Regulation D and the Regulation S, depending on if you're in the US or if you're getting your money outside, and that was all created after the stock market crash. So what they're trying to protect is like a less savvy investor throwing money at companies that just come knocking on their door, or they see an ad for it and they're like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And there's a lot of, unknown or uncertainty that kind of take advantage, like the idea of a rug. The idea of a rug is from the 1930s, because that was super common back then.
They had NFTs in the 1930s?
I mean, they had the concept of rugging in the 1930s.
Sure.
Just in a more archaic form. And so when the SEC's kind of protecting you, they're doing it, but it is really restrictive. So you have to think, if the more that whatever you're doing looks like it's raising funds to build what you're promising, the more the SEC is going to really look at that with a microscope to make sure that you're ticking off every single box of not being a security.
Yeah.
And what that looks like is, if you already have a formed product, then it doesn't really look like a raise, does it? Because if you have a product that if someone invests in it on day one, everyone's using it already. So the amount of users you already have on your product, if you can be like, my wallet has 30,000 daily users. This is where I don't know numbers because I'm not a builder, but 30,000 feels strong.
Great.
So if I have 30,000 daily users on my wallet every day, and I'm launching a token that's going to help build faster transactions in my wallet somehow, that's a good utility use for the token. And it's hard to argue that I'm launching this token to build this wallet because it's already built and people are already using it. So that makes a harder argument for the SEC to be like, this was a raise, and you did a public raise, and you didn't keep it to just accredited investors. Because if you do a raise, you can do a raise, but you need to keep it to accredited investors.
Right. And can you just define an accredited investor for everybody?
Accredited investors are captured by a minimum threshold of wealth, not including your primary household, of over $1 million, or a minimum threshold of about $250K earnings a year for the past 2 years, with the perspective of it continuing in the future. And then there's like licensing thresholds and a couple other exceptions for the thresholds. But really, it's like if you're talking friends and family, then it's the 250 earning minimum or the $1 million wealth minimum aside from your primary dwelling. And so that kind of, I don't know about you, but that can really cut out a lot of people. And if you're not KYCing, knowing your customer, to know when you're dropping that token who's getting it, to ensure the SEC that those tokens are in fact going to accredited investors, you are pretty exposed, right? Like, that's hard to mitigate for after the fact. But if you do things like mitigate in advance or ensure that your token's going to accredited investors, then you don't have to be so worried about a public raise. Private raises are a little bit more manageable because you can KYC a lot easier.
I mean, is it possible to KYC and have accredited investors on the SNS? I don't think that's.
This is where I'm not certain if that's out there. But a builder, if you build it, maybe it is a good tool.
I don't think that's currently possible under the current system. But again, the SNS is brand new and it's evolving, and sort of it's going to move and change with these pieces. I'll just show my cards. I'm not an accredited investor, so don't hit me up for.
Look, there's not. I will say it's hard to like make sure you're an accredited investor, especially in this market time, because I mean, even your primary resident. Look at housing markets right now. If you can't include your primary residence, then that threshold for wealth is significant.
Yeah, and so. But pulling money in via the SNS is not necessarily like having money come in as a part of that swap, which would inherently be a part of it. That's not immediately disqualifying either.
No, because it comes down to what that token is doing, which is a lot trickier, which is why you see like there's several thousands of tokens that aren't listed on Coinbase or Binance in the US because there's such a threshold to ensure that those tokens are at minimum likely arguably not securities. Now you're seeing the Coinbase take a step back. They're starting to delist some tokens because they were riding fast and loose for a while, allowing some to go through, and now they're trying to mitigate and undo some damage because they're about to take on the SEC in a significant way, and we're all rooting for them because what they do and how they get their answers will impact all of us, because there is a level of uncertainty right now in the US, which is why if you don't have to be here, you shouldn't. This is where the US is missing out because they're playing their cards very strongly, but what they're failing to grasp is that it has never been easier not to be here. If you have real investors and you have a product they believe in, they will pay to go offshore and do this the right way, and the US will just miss out. And what that means is you'll miss out on the initial drop. So your tokens won't be available in the US. You'll have to geo-block and block VPNs. But if you've got an investor that believes, they'll pay, and they do. And that's what I do. I offshore companies all the time. And the US is just going to miss out until the tokens launched significantly enough, or the utility is strong enough, or there's sufficient decentralization to argue that the product is now not a security.
And if you are a U.S. company and you decide to offshore, does that provides more protection, or is the SEC just gonna be like, you're American, we don't care?
Well, the SEC will always find a way. I mean, pardon my French, it's like the long dick of the law will always reach as far as it can. So the SEC will always find a way.
I don't think that's quite how that phrase goes, but yeah, the SEC wants to be fucky. That's clear.
They'll reach as far as they can. And so they'll find ways. Like I work with companies that are already offshore with no US ties that want that jurisdictional comfort analysis in the US because of how strong the US will go after if the token's being used in the US. So if you are a US company and you've taken the time to offshore and you're personally in the US, that leaves you pretty exposed. So chances are you'll take extra precautions and ensure that no VPNs are allowed, and all the KYC is done until you reach a comfort threshold in that token where it is so arguably utilized that it can't just be a funding mechanism, or it's so sufficiently decentralized that it is truly a DAO and there's no one holding a big bag enough to impact or put their thumb on the scale of that operation.
All right, we're gonna get really into the weeds here. So we have, known neurons that people follow on our NNS, our on-chain governance system. And ICDevs, which is one of the big ones, has been doing an automatic no vote on all SNS releases out of concerns for regulatory issues. Are they right? Are they wrong? Should we all be following ICDevs? Should we be telling ICDevs they're going about this wrong? Can you give a little sort of clarity? Can I, as a US citizen, vote for Kinix SNS, or am I putting myself at risk by not even investing, just voting for it?
Yeah, it gets really tricky. So having ICDevs as a known neuron, are those members known?
The members
is
are
it just
known.
like the
It's
IC?
associated with a U.S.-based nonprofit.
Yeah, so out of an abundance of caution, they're probably just saying no until, well, because I think the SNS system is so fresh, seeing kind of how those launches go, out of an abundance of caution, they probably just said, we need a little bit more clarity before we move forward. And so cautionarily, they're just saying no, which is, I mean, that's not a bad like legal approach to
Sure.
take. But in the future, will they always have to say no? Probably not. They might have to create some sort of threshold to be able to vote yes when it is a U.S. issue. Because they're in the U.S. and they're so obviously in the U.S., they're known, they do have to think carefully about what those votes mean and where they're going when they do say yes. What is the point of being an SNS and always saying no? What's the point of,
Well, so
what are they getting out of that?
Well, so to be launched on the SNS, it has to be approved by the NNS governance chain.
Yeah.
So it goes through the entire governance chain because the whole thing, it's
and they're
all.
the only ones saying no, always?
Well, I mean, lots of people say yes or no,
Yeah,
but because
okay.
we have this follow system, so I'm team follow neuron. I don't believe in voting manually. I like having all my votes automatically done. So you set it to follow. So instead of me setting my vote every time, I follow you, and then whatever you vote, I follow you. So they've been out there telling people, if you follow us, we are going to vote no out of an abundance of caution.
Yeah.
But if they set up a meeting with you and said, hey, we're reconsidering our automatic no votes, what would be some of the things you would tell them to think about for, are there ways they could vote? And again, we're not even investing, we're just voting.
Yeah, on
yes or
if
no.
something gets launched.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting, it's a very cautious approach, but I think they're thinking probably about the system as a whole when in that vote and not just the fact that a yes or no can affect that particular company. I think they're thinking of it like yes or no affects the entire ICP network.
Yeah.
As in, if one of those tokens is in fact a security, they can at least say they didn't approve it.
Yeah.
So it's like plausible deniability. Will that argument fly with the SEC? Not if they have their way, but that's what Coinbase is fighting for right now. So that's why we're all rooting for them very hard. But I think that's a good cautious approach at the moment. They probably could reassess, but again, if they get into reassessing, then that's a more hands-on approach. And this is like the efforts of others, where it's like, because the system is so intertwined in its DAO essence, how much efforts of others? Because the system relies on you kind of staking your votes with someone else, like you're kind of relying on an effort of others there. So the decentralization argument, nothing in law is usually like binary. It's more like a scale. So like if we slide the scale where it's like you're less sufficiently decentralized because I'm relying on staking my votes with this other entity, then you need to increase, an argument in another field to kind of balance out your overall argument that this isn't a security. So it becomes really challenging to kind of constantly be tinkering with these levers that affect this overall picture. And I think that's probably what they're waiting on, is to see how the SEC reacts to the idea that people are kind of, it's a republic. You're adding your votes to a designated votee.
All right.
We're back.
Yes, we're back. So just a quick reminder, that talk continued. It was a great session. It was a bit long, so we had to cut it to 30 minutes. But a little bit later today, the full version of that will be a separate video on YouTube. But right now we have Laura live, so we can ask some of the great questions that we have coming out of the audience right now.
Yeah, and questions that we get, I just want to quickly say, like, we've not seen this much activity during the live streaming of a talk. I think similar to what we saw at the conference, people have questions about this topic. Low Freaky hears that he or she is so glad that this finally got uploaded. And yeah, I think, Isaac, you just said it, but there's going to be the full-length talk as well. So we had to stop at 30 minutes here, but the actual talk went a bit longer. And if you're interested to see the entire talk, then go see on our YouTube channel a bit later today when it's going to be put live.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, this question stood out, so I want to highlight this one first. This is by Fuentes. if there's a malfunction or bug in a canister, who would be legally responsible for any losses incurred? And I know obviously the answer is probably going to be, it depends, right? But I would say I want to add some context. So let's say, for example, a decentralized exchange, they get a professional audit done, they launch on the SNS, and then something happens with some kind of bug, and somebody loses $1 million on that platform. So, there's a lot of different parties involved, and we've kind of gone through this a little bit in the chat. Like, what might be some things you could say, or like things that might be considered if this were to become a case? Because I think this is kind of I don't know, something that people think about right now within our ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I love that you know me well enough to already know that it depends.
Yeah.
But in that scenario, I would say a lot of times the law kind of works in a clunky way. So if there's a DAO that's responsible for some sort of DeFi protocol, and then that DAO spends money and gets an audit to make it stronger, the person that gets hurt, the user, will probably still sue the DAO. But they might be able to pull in the auditor into that lawsuit, or they might be able to directly sue the auditor. But a lot of times law can be really clunky and you have to sue the DAO, and then the DAO sues the auditor. So it becomes this like 3-part thing. But either way, the fact that there's an auditor in that equation takes some of that burden, because you're paying for a service, and if that service isn't, if that contract isn't fulfilled, because they guaranteed that this code was X amount good. I don't really know how those contracts look or what that ultimately looks like, but whatever service they're providing, if they can be shown to have breached that or been negligent, then ultimately they're going to be the ones with the burden of the payment. But it might be clunky in that the DAO has to also be part of or party to a lawsuit, which is tricky but since the MakerDAO the UkiDAO case came out, like, DAOs can get sued for various things, even if they're completely decentralized and they don't have a very formal entity. And at least in the US, the courts are permitting some lawsuits to go forward even without any sort of, and if the DAO doesn't reply, there can be a default judgment against that DAO. Now, how that's enforced in practice, right? So there's the legal approach you can take, and then the reality that you're in. Right now, it would be hard to say the ways in which the US can really shut down a DAO if they don't have access to the wallet, right? So it's a little trickier to you can get a judgment against somebody, but the next step is then also enforcing it and getting your money back. And that's a whole other 900-pound gorilla in the room for how to actually implement and enforce and take this to the finish line kind of thing in US law, or some of these DAOs don't have enough US connections to really be pulled into this jurisdiction. Now, the US is very broad and tends to overreach, as I made a point to say.
Very colorfully.
Hey, but you'll remember that.
Yeah.
So that, like, to say that the US can't reach you, so the US may be able to reach you, but then how does it ultimately get enforced? And that's something that's very uncertain or unsettled to this day, because how then, if it's a bunch of keys that are in the brains of 5 guys across the globe, how then does the US shut down that particular wallet and get access to that particular wallet? So it's really tricky. I mean, the ICP system has ways, because it's so decentralized, that like the community as a whole can distribute autonomously if there's certain permissions. So ICP is kind of unique in that it really can be decentralized in a lot of ways, but even still, is that enough pressure for the US government to be able to say, all right, now you have to move this money, or this money is definitely required to be moved in some way? Yeah,
that's great. I might be a little optimistic, but I almost kind of think that should there be a judgment against the DAO, someone would submit a proposal to pay whatever is owed, and that it would be approved, just because we kind of all want to be good citizens, right? Like we don't want to be. I mean, the core team is probably doxxed. We probably know who they are. They probably want to be able to show their face in the U.S. again, or whatever it's going to be. So I think in most cases, unless of course the ruling is unpayable or ridiculously insane or whatever else, I'd like to believe that the community will come together and kind of do the right thing. But I guess we'll wait and see.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, and it's always the most ridiculous of situations that comes to light and sets the tone for how these things get resolved. Because if it really is straightforward, you're right. People are generally reasonable, and you can predict what the average person is going to do. So you can comfortably say, under really normal, tame circumstances, this will go decently smooth. But what will get case law on is the absolute train wrecks, the dumpster fires that blow up. And that, you know, along with being more entertaining to read, is also how you navigate the more absurd scenarios or nuance in these more generic scenarios.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And we got one other question here by McBite. That's a fun name, McBite. In the event of a DAO dissolution, how does the law view the distribution of assets? And I actually like this question because a lot of DAOs assume that they're going to be eternal. You know, like an ancient great god, they're just never going to not exist. And obviously that's false. Like we're going to see DAOs.
Are you saying also that DAOs never existed in the first place? Like
they're not self-sustaining from the
you're
beginning.
Opening kind of worms here with that comparison.
Yeah. But anyway, so I think it's I've almost thought like there might need to be in the future some type of like DAO standard that takes into account some type of kill switch or whatever, like have an allocation for when it dies. But I don't know if that's really a plan for most DAOs. Like they don't really plan for their dissolution. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are around this topic, because I don't hear people even thinking about or considering the dissolution of a DAO.
So this comes down to, this is also comparable to like two guys that are trying to build a startup or like start something, right? You need to plan, like when you form, it's all great, but it's when you decide to dissolve or separate that there's tension, and it's not really that great or smooth. So in any formation, a partnership or a DAO as a whole, you need to be thinking about your exit plan for just to lay the ground rules. It's like, here's the ground rules for when we don't agree on everything, because obviously right now we agree on everything, but that's an ideal world that just doesn't exist. So let's try and set these ground rules for what happens when we don't agree on everything. And that is generally referred to as an operating agreement or corporate, your articles of incorporation or your bylaws. Those are the terms you hear. And that just means this is what you're using as like your rules of order for how to operate or dissolve your company. So, and that goes for DAOs, that goes for any sort of formation. If you're going to build something with someone, you need to have rules for the game, because you're building, and there just needs to be a certain baseline for how to navigate when things aren't perfect. And that's really what an operating agreement or bylaws do. And that's for any jurisdiction in the US, outside of the US, whatever entity you form, you need to formalize some entity, even if it is a DAO, because this is why. But like acknowledging that this is an entity that's working and building something or navigating something, you need to identify that entity, the players in that entity to the extent that you can, and the rules of the game for that entity. And so it doesn't matter if you're in the US or wherever, this is very important documentation that you need. I do think a great, or at least an exciting jurisdiction for a DAO that supports more DAO ethos is in the Marshall Islands. And they're doing interesting stuff with it. They've been very thoughtful with their legislation. But even if you're in the Marshall Islands, if you have enough US ties, you still might have to have a US entity. So it gets kind of complicated quickly. But either way, you need to have documentation for how to start, how to wind up or wind down whatever it is you're doing. And that documentation will cover how those assets are distributed upon dissolution, how the IP is distributed, whatever it is, those documents will reference that. And if you don't have anything written, then whatever jurisdiction you're in will tend to have default rules for people that didn't get it together to create these documents. So each state has default rules for general partnerships or LLCs. And other jurisdictions have default rules for how to dissolve an entity. You just have to figure out which entity your DAO mirrors in that jurisdiction. But it's important to acknowledge a jurisdiction, because if you have a DAO with members across the country or across the globe, you need to know what jurisdiction rules, because how Guam treats DAOs might be very different than how Switzerland treats DAOs. And there might be a way better jurisdiction, a more favorable jurisdiction that you'd want to have be the governing jurisdiction. But if you don't have anything and people are everywhere, then anyone can assert that their jurisdiction is the true DAO jurisdiction, and these rules should apply.
So this is connected with a question that I actually wrote down as I was rewatching your talk. And you just brought up the Marshall Islands, and I think during the talk you mentioned the BVIs, the Caymans, and a few other jurisdictions. One question that a lot of people have is, and you mentioned that you offshore companies all the time, right? So let's say there is a founder team, 2 people in the US, 2 people in, let's say, Switzerland, so somewhere else as well. What does it actually mean to offshore your company? Does it mean the team is moving to the Marshall Islands? Does the team have to be in the Marshall Islands every now and then to make strategic decisions? Does the team need to pay for some substance in those jurisdictions? Or what actually constitutes offshoring a company?
So that's a great question. It means that certain assets of that company or certain operational facets of that company are going to operate offshore. So chances are, if you have a US person, you're going to have some sort of US entity, because they need to have their assets captured or acknowledged in the US in a way that's separate from them. So they'll set up a US arm. Plus, a lot of times, if you're talking VCs and fundraising, those VCs want to see a US Delaware C Corp. And I'm sorry that it's that way, but if you want big VC money, you need to have a nicely formed Delaware C Corp with a package they want to see, bylaws they want to see, something that they're very comfortable with if they're going to throw money at your company. So a lot of times you'll see that even without a US person, you'll see a Delaware C Corp, because these guys are going after funds. Now, just because you have that Delaware C Corp doesn't mean that you can do everything in the US. So you might set up a Cayman Foundation and a BVI entity because you want to launch a token. And some of that fundraise that you're doing is through a token generating event. So you don't want to have that token generating event happen in the US, in that Delaware C Corp. You want to have that token generating event happen in BVI or in Switzerland. And so the BVI or Swiss entity creates and generates the token, but the foundation in the Cayman is the operator, the board for navigating that company. And then the Delaware C Corp maybe owns the IP and has a service agreement with those 2 other entities. So it gets a little complicated, and that's the highest view I can give you without drilling down into it and just making your eyes glaze. But to get you to kind of understand how these entities, there's entities that operate amongst each other, and they all have a special role because of how you have to separate that token so that you're complying with SEC and certain fund laws and all of these various and complicated 3-letter agencies that like to have a say on what you're doing. And so it sounds like a lot, but it does flow smoother, and that's traditionally what we've seen companies do. We're seeing a lot of companies form in Switzerland. Zug is like a Silicon Valley for decentralization right now. But Switzerland's really expensive and kind of takes some time. Whereas BVI and Cayman are traditionally a little faster for DAOs exclusively. RMI, the Marshall Islands, has, a great option. We're seeing a couple different, countries kind of try and become relevant. It's Panama is up there, but Panama is also like you'll be working with an attorney and then all of a sudden they ghost you. And it's like, well, that's the rub of like using that as a way. But it seems like Cayman and BVI have kind of resolved a lot. And even though more legislation is coming, there's more hoops to jump through. There's still manageable hoops at this point.
Oh wow,
Great.
very
You're
insightful.
using the word entity so much, it almost sounds like you're an exorcist or something. But it's a lot of great info here. So just for those who've joined us, we normally would end at 60 minutes, but we're gonna, for this talk, considering the context and a huge amount of questions, overwhelming amount of questions, we will be pushing to the 75 minutes, so another 15 minutes here. And I just want to emphasize real quick, for more information, Laura represents IBL Partners. So there's iblpartners.com. Obviously, she's probably one of the first lawyers you've ever heard mention the words, the phrases unique to our ecosystem, like NNS and SNS. So if you're a project within the space, we highly recommend that you approach her. And she knows her stuff, as you can see. So, one quick question. Sorry, Cedric, you have something?
Yeah, one question that I quickly wanted to bring up. It's we'll switch gears a little bit, but I think this is one that probably a lot of people will think about at some point. So Abraham asked if there's any regulatory issues around the use of stable coins. And now I think that could be interpreted in lots of ways, as like a person, as a DAO, as a company. And I'm sure we'll probably not have time to dive into all those different options, but it'd be great to just get a bit of like a high level temperature check from you on like what stable coins are safe to use from a regulatory standpoint, or what people have to think about when they do use some stable coins in the course of their business or DAO activity.
So I think, any token is going to have its own regulatory battle as to whether or not it's considered a security. However, stable coins have at least navigated that a little bit more, because it's hard to argue that it's an investment when it's always kind of a flat line. So I think the bigger regulatory issue around stable coins is ensuring that you're not using it illicitly or fraud. So the lift on like a stable coin is a little bit less cumbersome, because it's not that I'm sure the SEC can make an argument if they wanted to, but it's harder to argue that it's there's an expectation of profit with a stable coin investment. So
I think if anything, history has told us if it's not flat, then it's only going down, right?
Yeah. So I think it's safe in that respect. Now it might be more CFTC arena where it's regulated like a commodity, which would be still not as heavy of a lift as navigating or registering as a security under the SEC. It's like a little bit cleaner to deal with. I'm sure there'll be more issues coming, but as of now, in terms of like the tree of things that's gonna wreck your life, stable coins is more of like a small branch than like the trunk, which is the SEC navigation of it all.
Great. And then there's this one. This is a little broad too, but this is a question by Angel. Are there any legal risks to be aware of when using the NNS or SNS? And I think this will probably be mostly within a context of users. So for example, I'm a known neuron and I'm pretty doxed. My first and last name are on my Twitter and everything. And everybody knows the state I live in and all of that. So my voting history is public. Is there anything that maybe I should consider as a known neuron on the NNS? And then likewise, the SNS is very similar. I think at least early on, most projects will really only have the core team being followed very heavily, so that most people will just follow the core team. Everybody wants to vote, so that they earn rewards. So really, the core team kind of has full control, even though it's the distribution of the token might be decentralized. So is there anything like within those two contexts that should be of concern or somebody to think of?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the core team who's like in control, there's definitely a case in, I think it was New Hampshire, where the court kind of dinged the founding team, and made it more lean towards a security because of how many tokens the core team kept. So it's harder to argue that that token isn't an investment because they were arguing that the token was for use on the network, right? That's the argument, that if it's not an investment, it's for use on the network. So the core team was saying, no, we have these, we only kept 10% this to use the network. But in reality, 10% was still so many tokens that like one person couldn't arguably use or need to operate the network. So the court said, like, then if you couldn't possibly use all these, then why are you keeping these? The other logical step would be you're keeping them because they're an investment, and thus this is an investment vehicle known as an investment contract under the SEC terms, and it's a security. So that's where one court came down. So I think in terms of like founding team members trying to keep a reasonable grasp, I mean, obviously you want to hold on to them because like you're putting your blood, sweat, and tears into this, but that's also something you need to think about if you're trying to argue that your network is so decentralized that it doesn't fall into the investment contract under the Howey test because it's so decentralized, but you're holding on to like an unfair weight on the scale. So you have to keep that in mind, that extra weight, in how you vote on things and how you tip the scales on things because you're a no neuron, or because it's like the difference between like being an influencer and everyone's aping into this token. Like, to what extent does your eating or voting on something create like an influence that one could argue, now you're manipulating, or this is fraud, or you've been paid off. So I think keeping a grasp on limiting undue influence, I guess, or making sure that this isn't a rug, you're not a scammer, you're keeping everything above board, would be something if you're doxed completely. If you're going to get behind a project because you are who you are and everyone loves you from the ICP network and they all trust you, and now you're going to back this little nobody project and all of a sudden everybody apes into it and then you dump your coins, that's going to be looked well upon by the SEC, especially because it's easy to track that, it's easy to see that, and you're starting to see certain celebrities get dinged by the SEC in lawsuits now. You're starting to see some of this follow up. So just because it wasn't, it's not like the headline of the SEC's regulatory prowess right now, doesn't mean it's not something they're not considering and like taking action for slowly, at least with the big names too. But there is a lot of value to the NNS and the SNS because it can be so decentralized. And in that vein, that's a great argument towards like a true utility token and a true decentralized governance argument. So the more you can keep that kind of pure, the stronger it'll be.
We did talk a lot about the SEC and whether something is an investment, but another question that I remember coming up first, probably like 6-7 years ago, so in like 2015, 2016, when people were first starting to store information on the blockchain, which coincided with the introduction of GDPR in Europe. There were lots of questions around like data and privacy and the right to be forgotten, which exists in the EU, how to implement that on a blockchain. Now, the IC, this is one of the, I guess, different paradigms in the IC compared to many other blockchains, is that data can actually be erased. You can still verify that a certain state existed, but you cannot necessarily find that state down the road. So just curious how, I'm sure this comes up with clients quite a few times as well, like what are kind of the guidelines or the cornerstones that someone has to be aware of as it comes to data privacy and data storage on blockchains?
Yeah, so this is definitely a legacy Web 2 problem that Web 3 complicates by having an immutable record, basically. So you have to remember that government moves so much more slowly than any other thing out there. Bureaucracy is the worst sometimes, and it just moves incredibly slow. It's inevitable and it will get there, but it just moves so slow. So the internet's been around for almost 20 years now, that like everyone's been adopted since 2000. Like every household's had a computer and internet access, whether it be dial-up or not, it's been there. So what we are seeing now after 23 years of having this in someone's home is that, oh, the government's like, hey, we need to remediate and have some protections here. So you're seeing, I mean, GDPR was at the forefront of ensuring European data privacy. The US has, you know, a lobbying system that makes it a little bit harder to protect the people, but it's getting there. There's certain standards that you have to meet. And that privacy policy is a legacy Web 2 issue. If you have a website of any kind, you need to have a privacy policy. You just do. It's 2023. If you don't have a like at least a basic privacy policy on your website is exposed. It just is. And they're not, you know, incredibly cumbersome, especially if you're not doing that much with data. The more connectivity you have, like if I'm connecting my wallet to your website, now you need to explain what you're doing with that. If you have, you know, a server, like if you're using Google for your hosting and Google has certain metrics they pull from anyone visiting your website, you need to at least reference like, hey, you know, this is the service I use, see their website for their privacy policy. We don't, you know, me as my company doesn't collect that, but this company does. It's about a lot of privacy policy. Obviously you can't run crazy and collect everything and sell it. That's not what I'm saying, but a lot of it is just informing your users, hey, we do collect cookies and this is where they go, or we don't do this, but this other website might. You know, it's a lot of just information. It's on the user to look at those policies and decide whether or not they're comfortable with them. But it's not that you have to implement all this extra tech. It's a lot about informing your users what you're doing and then ensuring that what you are doing or what you are collecting or selling isn't violating any laws.
All right. Well, thank you so much for answering that. I think that's just about all the questions we have time for. And I know it's tough because a lot of these topics we could probably go into for, you know, each one could be its own talk a lot of times. But you know, just for those who want more information, again, visit iblpartners.com. Laura's great. She's always also traveling and going to different conferences and events all over the world. So maybe you can catch her at one of those as well. In fact, Laura, what's that? You're going to Paris, right?
Yeah, if you'll be in Paris for ECC, hit me up.
Perfect. Yeah. So next one coming up is Paris. And, you know, I know Cedric's going to that one as well. So if you're anywhere near the area, ECC in Paris coming up very soon here. It's going to be a great one. I just want to hit on a few brief things. So our live stream series is every Thursday at 8 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. CET. So be sure to join us next week. We've got David Del Busco from Juno coming on. So we're very excited to kind of see his talk, but also he's had a ton of great updates. He made launched a drawing app, and there's a lot of great things since his talk that we can catch up with him on as well. So be sure to check in for that. Make sure to like, follow, and hit the subscribe bell on YouTube so that you're notified, because the best way to interact with these live streams is live. You can also join our ICP groups on WhatsApp, where we have a lot of great content coming out. And I think we're going to be doing from out of that another speed networking session fairly soon, those are really fun. You click on the URL and it randomly hooks you up with one-on-one chats for a few minutes with people. So I think we have an announcement for one of those coming out fairly soon. And then speaking of something that we're keeping on a DL a little bit, this is the Zeely keyword for those who stuck with us through everything. It's learned chaos, no spaces. So we're not officially announcing this. This is in closed beta, but for those out there who might want to be part of our ambassador program, keep your ears peeled for more info on that coming out fairly soon here, probably within the next week. And great. So I think I covered all of my announcements. I think we're all good here. I'd like to thank everyone from joining this talk. Appreciate your time. Don't forget to fight the FUD and stay bullish out there.
Thanks so much, Laura, for joining us. This has been very informative. Thanks so much. All the best.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Have a great one.